The evening sky was turning a deep purple as Judge Marcus Henderson gathered his papers from his mahogany desk. At 53 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from 15 years of serving on the bench. His salt and pepper hair and warm brown eyes gave him a trustworthy appearance that put people at ease in his courtroom. It had been a particularly long Thursday at the courthouse. The case he'd been presiding over involved a complex drug trafficking operation, and the evidence portion had taken longer than expected. The wall clock showed 8:45 p.m., much later than his usual departure time of 6:30. Marcus stretched his tall frame and slipped his black judicial robe off his broad shoulders, carefully hanging it on the wooden coat rack near his chamber door. Underneath, he wore a crisp navy blue suit that his wife Sandra had helped him pick out last month. He smiled, thinking of how she always insisted he dress the part of a distinguished judge, even if his robe covered everything during court sessions. The courthouse halls were quiet now, their usual bustling energy replaced by the soft hum of cleaning equipment in the distance. Marcus nodded to Jim, the elderly night janitor who had been working there even longer than he had been a judge. "Good night, Your Honor." Jim called out with a friendly wave. "Don't work too hard now." Marcus chuckled, his deep voice echoing slightly in the empty corridor. "You're one to talk, Jim. Don't stay too late yourself." Their familiar exchange was part of his routine on late nights like this. Walking through the parking garage, his footsteps echoed against the concrete walls. Most of the spaces were empty now, save for a few cars belonging to other late workers. His black Mercedes S-Class sat in its reserved spot, the Judge M. Henderson nameplate reflecting the fluorescent lighting above. As he settled into the leather driver's seat, Marcus thought about the day's proceedings. The young defendant's face kept appearing in his mind, another black man caught up in the system. While Marcus always maintained strict impartiality in his rulings, he couldn't help but feel a deeper understanding of the complex social factors that often led young men down such paths. It was one of the reasons he had helped establish a youth mentorship program in the community 3 years ago. The car's engine purred to life, and the dashboard display illuminated with a text message from Sandra. "Dinner in the microwave. Love you." He smiled, appreciating how his wife of 28 years still looked after him, even with their children grown and out of the house. Marcus pulled out of the parking garage and onto the quiet downtown streets. The city looked different at this hour, peaceful, almost serene. Street lamps cast warm circles of light on the sidewalks, and the occasional late-night pedestrian hurried past closed storefronts. He turned onto Mason Avenue, taking his usual route home to the suburbs. The radio played softly in the background, a jazz station that helped him decompress after long days. Tonight it was Miles Davis, "Kind of Blue." The familiar melody helped ease the tension in his shoulders as he thought about tomorrow's docket. He had 3 sentencing hearings in the morning, and he wanted to review the case files one more time before making his decisions. At the intersection of Mason and 43rd Street, Marcus stopped at a red light. He noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror, a common sight in this part of town. He didn't think much of it. After all, he had worked alongside law enforcement for decades, first as a prosecutor and then as a judge. He had always maintained professional relationships with the police department, even leading the Commission on Improving Police Community Relations last year. The light turned green, and Marcus continued his drive. The street was nearly empty now, and his headlights cut through the growing darkness. He was looking forward to getting home, heating up Sandra's dinner, and maybe catching the end of the basketball game before bed. Little did Marcus know that this routine drive home, one he had made thousands of times before, was about to become anything but ordinary. The police cruiser behind him was still following, and its lights were about to flash into life, setting in motion a chain of events that would change not only his life, but the entire community's perspective on law enforcement and racial justice. As Marcus later reflected, it was strange how the most significant moments in life often began on the most ordinary of evenings, when you least expected them. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed in Judge Henderson's rearview mirror, their harsh glow filling his car's interior. He checked his speedometer, 35 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Years of experience told him he hadn't made any traffic violations, but he knew exactly what to do in this situation. Officer James Barrett, a 34-year-old patrol officer with 8 years on the force, watched as the black Mercedes pulled over smoothly to the curb. He ran the license plate through his computer before stepping out. The registration showed the car belonged to someone named Henderson, but Barrett had already made assumptions about the driver. Marcus turned off his jazz music and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. He'd had this conversation with his own son too many times. Keep calm, be polite, but know your rights. Through his side mirror, he watched the officer approach, noting how the man's hand rested near his weapon. License and registration. Barrett barked before even reaching the window completely. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. His flashlight beam shot directly into Marcus's face, making him squint. "Good evening, officer," Marcus replied calmly, his deep voice steady. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Barrett's response came sharp and quick. "I said license and registration. We can discuss the reason after you comply with my orders." Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, but his face remained composed. 20 years on the bench had taught him how to maintain a calm exterior even in tense situations. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I believe I have the right to know why I've been stopped." "Listen here." Barrett's voice grew harder, his southern accent becoming more pronounced with his rising anger. "I don't need to explain myself until you show me some ID. For all I know, this could be a stolen vehicle." The judge noticed how Barrett's body language had become increasingly aggressive. The flashlight beam hadn't moved from his face, and now a second hand had moved closer to the gun holster. Marcus could feel his own suit jacket becoming damp with sweat, despite the cool evening air. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," Barrett commanded, taking a step back and putting his hand fully on his weapon. Marcus's mind raced through his options. As a judge, he knew every detail of the law surrounding traffic stops. As a black man in America, he knew the danger of sudden movements. "Officer Barrett," he said, reading the nameplate on the uniform, "I want to cooperate, but I need you to understand that I'm going to move very slowly." "How do you know my name?" Barrett snapped, pulling his weapon halfway out of its holster. "Step out now." The situation was escalating dangerously. Marcus could see a young couple walking their dog on the other side of the street, watching the scene unfold. He thought of Sandra waiting at home, of his children, of the thousands of cases he presided over involving police encounters gone wrong. "I'm going to reach for my ID now," Marcus announced clearly, making each movement deliberate and slow. "It's in my left inner jacket pocket. I am a criminal court judge, and my credentials are with my driver's license." Barrett's flashlight beam finally wavered. "You expect me to believe that? Just get out of the car now." Marcus continued his slow movement, drawing out his wallet. His judicial badge caught the flashlight's beam as he opened it, the gold surface reflecting brightly. Barrett's eyes widened as he read the credentials. "The Honorable Marcus Henderson, Superior Court Judge." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Barrett's hand dropped from his weapon, and the flashlight beam finally lowered. The officer's face, previously twisted in aggression, now showed something between shock and fear. "Judge Henderson?" Barrett's voice had lost its edge, replaced by uncertainty. I didn't." "Yes, Officer Barrett," Marcus replied, his voice level but carrying the weight of his position. "Now, would you please explain why you pulled me over? And this time, I'm not asking as a civilian, but as the judge who chairs the Police Oversight Committee for this district." The night air grew thick with tension as both men realized this routine traffic stop had just become something much more significant. Behind them, more cars were slowing down to watch, their headlights illuminating a scene that would soon become the talk of the entire city. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours, though it was only seconds. Officer Barrett shifted his weight from one foot to another, his face now visible in the glow of approaching car headlights. Several vehicles had slowed down to observe the scene, their presence adding to the tension. "Sir, Your Honor," Barrett stammered, his earlier aggression replaced by nervous energy. There was a report of a similar vehicle involved in suspicious activity in this area. Marcus Henderson's expression remained neutral, though his eyes narrowed slightly. After 15 years on the bench, he had developed a keen sense for detecting lies. "Officer Barrett, I've been driving this route home from the courthouse for over a decade. What specific suspicious activity are you referring to?" More cars were stopping now. Someone had started recording with their phone from across the street. Barrett noticed this too, his neck reddening under his collar. "Well, you see." Barrett's hand unconsciously moved to adjust his body camera, which had been recording the entire encounter. There was a call about. About what exactly? Marcus pressed, his judicial tone emerging naturally. Because from where I sit, quite literally in this case, this appears to be a clear instance of racial profiling. Barrett's face flushed deeper. Sir, I resent that accusation. I'm just doing my job, following protocol. Let's review that protocol then, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the same authority it did in his courtroom. You followed my vehicle for approximately 6 blocks before initiating this stop. You approached with your hand on your weapon. You refused to state the reason for the stop, immediately demanded I exit the vehicle, and escalated to a show of force, all without probable cause. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk now. Someone whispered, "That's Judge Henderson." The name spread through the onlookers in hushed tones. Your Honor, if you'll just let me explain. Barrett started, but Marcus wasn't finished. Officer Barrett, I presided over hundreds of cases involving traffic stops. I've reviewed countless hours of body camera footage. I've seen good police work, and I've seen constitutional violations. Which category do you think this stop falls under? Barrett's radio crackled to life. Unit 247, status check. The gathering crowd had caught the attention of dispatch. Unit 247, situation under control. Barrett responded quickly, though his voice wavered slightly. He turned back to Marcus. Judge Henderson, I apologize if my approach seemed aggressive. Perhaps we could. Perhaps we could continue this discussion at the station, Marcus suggested firmly. I'd like to file a formal report, and I believe your body camera footage will be crucial evidence. Additionally, I'm curious about your traffic stop statistics for the past year. Barrett's face paled. He knew those statistics wouldn't paint a favorable picture. A police supervisor's car pulled up, lights flashing but no siren. Captain Sarah Rodriguez stepped out, immediately assessing the situation. She worked with Judge Henderson on several community initiatives and recognized him instantly. Judge Henderson, she called out, walking briskly toward them. Is everything all right here? Marcus turned slightly in his seat to address her. Captain Rodriguez, good evening. Officer Barrett and I were just discussing the importance of proper traffic stop procedures and constitutional rights. The captain's experienced eyes took in the scene, the nervous officer, the dignified judge, the gathering crowd with their phones, and the growing number of news cars pulling up. Someone had already called the local stations. Officer Barrett, Captain Rodriguez said sharply, return to your vehicle and wait for me there. As Barrett retreated, Marcus stepped out of his car, straightening his suit jacket. He stood tall, his presence commanding respect from everyone present. Sarah, he said quietly to the captain, this stops tonight. Not just for me, for every black person in this city who's been pulled over for suspicious activity or matching a description. Captain Rodriguez nodded solemnly. I understand, Your Honor. What would you like to do next? Marcus looked at the growing crowd, the recording phones, Officer Barrett sitting in his patrol car, and the arriving news vans. He knew this moment could either divide the community further or become a catalyst for real change. First, he said, we're going to make sure this incident is properly documented. Then, we're going to use it to make some long overdue changes in police training and accountability. The night air crackled with possibility as everyone present sensed they were witnessing something significant, a moment when justice wasn't just a word in a law book, but a real force for change in their community. The police station buzzed with unusual activity for 10:30 p.m. Word had spread quickly through the department that Judge Henderson was in the building, and the reason for his presence made everyone uncomfortable. Officers tried to look busy while stealing glances at the glass-walled conference room, where an emergency meeting was taking place. Inside the conference room, Judge Marcus Henderson sat at one end of the long table, his posture straight but relaxed. To his right sat Captain Rodriguez, and across from them, Officer Barrett seemed to shrink in his chair. Police Chief William Thompson, who had been called in from his home, completed the group. Let's review the body camera footage, Chief Thompson suggested, his face grave as he pressed play on the large screen mounted on the wall. The footage started with Barrett's approach to the Mercedes. Everyone in the room watched in silence as the scene unfolded. Barrett's aggressive tone, his hand constantly near his weapon, the unnecessary escalation, it all looked even worse on video. Marcus noticed how Barrett winced at certain points, particularly when his own voice barked orders without cause. The young officer was seeing himself through others' eyes for the first time, and the reality was clearly disturbing him. "Officer Barrett," Marcus spoke after the video ended, his voice surprisingly gentle. "How many traffic stops have you made this month?" Barrett swallowed hard. 47, Your Honor." "And how many of those drivers were black?" The room grew still. Captain Rodriguez pulled up the statistics on her laptop. 39, she answered when Barrett hesitated. Chief Thompson rubbed his temples. "In a city where black residents make up only 23% of the population." "I wasn't. I didn't." Barrett struggled to find words. "I was just stopping suspicious vehicles." "Define suspicious," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "Because I drive a Mercedes, wear a suit, and was coming from the courthouse where I've worked for 15 years. What made my vehicle suspicious, Officer Barrett?" Sweat appeared on Barrett's forehead. "Sir, The truth, please," Marcus insisted. "This isn't about destroying your career. It's about acknowledging the biases that influence our actions." Barrett looked down at his hands. "I guess. I saw a black man in an expensive car in that neighborhood, and I just assumed." His voice trailed off. "You assumed what many have assumed before," Marcus completed the thought. "And that assumption could have turned deadly tonight." The room fell silent as the weight of those words sank in. Everyone present knew how differently the situation could have ended if Marcus hadn't been a judge. Chief Thompson cleared his throat. "Judge Henderson, what would you like us to do here?" Officer Barrett's actions clearly violated department policy. Marcus studied Barrett's face for a long moment. The officer looked younger now, almost vulnerable. "I see two paths forward," he finally said. "We could process this as a formal complaint, leading to disciplinary action, or—" He paused, and everyone leaned forward slightly. "Or we could use this incident as a catalyst for change. Officer Barrett, would you be willing to work with me on a new training program, to share your experience and help other officers recognize their own biases?" Barrett's head snapped up, surprise clear on his face. You'd want me to do that? After how I treated you?" "Sometimes," Marcus said, "the best teachers are those who've learned the hardest lessons." He turned to Chief Thompson. "With your permission, Chief, I'd like to develop a comprehensive training program, not just about racial profiling, but about the human cost of these encounters." Captain Rodriguez was already taking notes. "We could start with the patrol units, then expand to the entire force." "And regular ride-alongs with community leaders," Marcus added. "Real relationships break down prejudices better than any classroom training." Barrett sat straighter in his chair. "I want to help," he said quietly. "I need to make this right." Marcus nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. "Then let's get to work, because tonight wasn't just about one traffic stop. It's about making sure every encounter between law enforcement and citizens is based on facts, not fears." Outside the conference room, officers who had been pretending not to watch saw something unexpected. Judge Henderson and Officer Barrett shaking hands. It wasn't the ending anyone had expected when the night began, but it might just be the beginning their department needed. By morning, the video of Judge Henderson's traffic stop had gone viral. Cell phone footage from bystanders showed up on social media, and local news stations ran the story as their lead. The police department's phone started ringing nonstop at 6 a.m., with reporters seeking comments about what they were calling the judge and the officer. Marcus sat in his kitchen, watching the morning news coverage while Sandra made coffee. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he got home late last night. There were messages from their children, other judges, civil rights lawyers, and even the mayor. "You're trending on Twitter," Sandra said, placing a steaming cup in front of him. Her face showed concern mixed with pride. "Are you sure you want to handle this your way? People are angry. They want Officer Barrett fired." Marcus took a sip of coffee, thinking carefully before answering. "Firing one officer won't fix the system, Sandra. We need to change hearts and minds." Across town, Officer James Barrett sat alone in his small apartment, watching the same news coverage. His phone was also buzzing, but with very different messages. Some fellow officers called him a disgrace. Others warned him he'd ruined his career. His mother had called crying, asking how she'd raised a son who could act that way. The doorbell rang, making Barrett jump. He opened it to find Captain Rodriguez standing there. "Get dressed," she said firmly. "The chief wants to see everyone involved in last night's incident. There's a crowd gathering outside the station." When Barrett arrived at the station 30 minutes later, he had to walk through a group of protesters. Their signs read "Fire Barrett" and "Justice for Judge Henderson." Someone recognized him and started booing. Barrett hurried inside, his face burning with shame. In the chief's office, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Thompson looked like he hadn't slept, his tie slightly crooked. "The mayor's office is demanding action," he said, pacing behind his desk. "The video has over 1 million views already." "Where's Judge Henderson?" Barrett asked quietly. As if on cue, Marcus walked into the office, looking fresh and composed in a gray suit. The room fell silent. "Good morning," Marcus said, taking a seat. "I see we've got quite a situation on our hands." Chief Thompson nodded. "Judge, the mayor wants to make an example of this case. He's talking about a full investigation of our traffic stop practices." "Good," Marcus replied, surprising everyone. "That's exactly what we need. But first, Officer Barrett and I have an announcement to make." Barrett looked up, confused. They hadn't planned any announcement. "The press is waiting in the conference room," Marcus continued. "Officer Barrett and I are going to tell them about our new training initiative, about how this incident will help change police culture from the inside out." But the protesters, Barrett started. "We'll see two men choosing to work together instead of against each other," Marcus finished. He turned to Barrett. "Are you ready to face them?" Barrett stood straighter. "Yes, Your Honor, I am." The press conference room was packed. Cameras flashed as Marcus and Barrett walked in together. The reporters fell silent, pencils poised, waiting for drama. Instead, they got something unexpected. Judge Henderson spoke about transformation, not punishment. He talked about using this incident to create real change. When Barrett stepped up to speak, his voice shook at first but grew stronger. "I was wrong," he said clearly into the microphones. "My actions that night came from prejudices I didn't even realize I had. But Judge Henderson showed me something powerful, that we can turn mistakes into opportunities for growth." Outside, the protesters listened on their phones as the press conference was live-streamed. Slowly, the angry chants died down. Some people looked confused, others thoughtful. Back in the conference room, Marcus concluded the press conference with a powerful statement. "Today, we choose a different path, not one of division and anger, but of understanding and change. Officer Barrett and I invite every officer, every citizen, to join us in this work." As they left the podium, a young reporter called out, "Is this really enough? Can one traffic stop change anything?" Marcus turned back to the microphones. "One traffic stop? No. But one moment of honesty, one decision to do better, one step toward understanding. That's where all real change begins." The cameras kept flashing, capturing an image that would become famous. A black judge and a white officer walking together toward a new beginning. 2 weeks after the traffic stop incident, Judge Marcus Henderson's courtroom was unusually crowded. Instead of lawyers and defendants, the gallery was filled with police officers, community leaders, and civil rights activists. Officer James Barrett sat in the front row, looking both nervous and determined. "Welcome to the first session of the Bridge the Gap program," Marcus announced, standing before them not in his judicial robe but in a regular suit. "Today, we begin something new in our city." The program had been Marcus's idea, developed during long discussions with Barrett, Chief Thompson, and community leaders. Its goal was simple but ambitious: to bring police officers face to face with the communities they served, in a setting where honest conversations could happen. "Officer Barrett," Marcus called out, "would you join me up here?" Barrett walked to the front, his uniform pressed perfectly. The other officers watched closely, some supportive, others skeptical. In the past 2 weeks, Barrett had become both the symbol of what was wrong with policing and what could be right about change. 2 weeks ago," Barrett began, his voice slightly shaky, "I pulled over Judge Henderson because of assumptions I made based on his race. Today, I want to tell you what I've learned since then." The room grew quiet. Even the usual courthouse noise seemed to fade away. I always thought I was one of the good ones, Barrett continued. I told myself I was just doing my job, being vigilant. But when I watched my body camera footage, I saw something different. I saw fear in Judge Henderson's eyes. The same fear I probably put in hundreds of other innocent people's eyes. In the back of the room, Sandra Henderson wiped away a tear. She'd been hesitant about her husband's approach at first, but seeing this moment made her understand his vision. Marcus stepped forward again. This program isn't about shame or blame, it's about understanding. Every week, we'll pair officers with community members. They'll share meals together, attend family events, and really get to know each other as people. He gestured to a wall where photos were displayed, pictures from the first community dinner held last week. Officers and residents sitting together, laughing, showing each other photos of their kids. But that's just the beginning, Marcus continued. We're also reviewing every traffic stop made in this city over the past year. The data will help us identify patterns and change policies. Captain Rodriguez stood up from her seat. We've already made changes to our training programs. Every new officer will spend time in community settings before ever making a traffic stop. And veterans like myself will be going through refresher courses. Barrett nodded. I've already started working with the training division. We're using my body camera footage as a teaching tool, showing what not to do, but also how to do better. From the middle of the room, a young black teenager raised his hand. Marcus recognized him from the youth program he mentored. Yes, Marcus Jr., the judge called on him. How do we know this will really change anything? The young man asked. How do we know we won't still get pulled over just for being black? Barrett stepped forward before Marcus could respond. That's a fair question. Change won't happen overnight. But every morning when I put on this uniform now, I ask myself one question. Am I serving my community, or am I serving my fears? Marcus smiled at the response. In 2 weeks, he watched Barrett transform from a defensive officer into someone willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Real change, Marcus addressed the room, happens person by person, conversation by conversation. It happens when we stop seeing uniforms and skin colors and start seeing human beings. He picked up a stack of papers from his bench. On these sheets are partner assignments. Each officer will be paired with a community member. Over the next 6 months, you'll get to know each other's families, share meals, attend events together. As the papers were passed out, there was a mix of nervousness and excitement in the room. Old barriers were about to come down. Remember, Marcus concluded, what happened 2 weeks ago could have ended very differently. Instead, we chose to turn a moment of confrontation into an opportunity for change. Now it's up to all of us to make that change real. The room burst into applause, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Barrett smiled a real smile. Something new was beginning in their city, and he was part of it. The community center was packed on a warm Saturday afternoon. Colorful banners hung from the walls announcing Bridge the Gap program, 6-month celebration. Children ran around wearing both plastic police badges and community leader stickers, while adults mingled, sharing stories and laughter. Judge Marcus Henderson stood near the entrance, watching Officer James Barrett play basketball with a group of teenagers. 6 months ago, these same teens would have walked away if they saw a police officer approaching. Now they were arguing playfully with Barrett about who had the better jump shot. Quite a change, isn't it? Sandra said, appearing beside her husband with 2 cups of lemonade. She handed one to Marcus, her eyes twinkling with pride. More than I ever hoped for, Marcus replied, taking a sip. The statistics paper in his pocket showed just how much had changed. Traffic stops were down 40%, complaints against officers had dropped by 60%, and community trust ratings had reached their highest level in 10 years. Across the room, Captain Rodriguez was showing photos on her phone to a group of community mothers. They were pictures from last week's police academy graduation, where new officers had received their badges from community members instead of department officials, a new tradition started by the program. Judge Henderson called out a familiar voice. Marcus turned to see Marcus Jr., the teenager who had asked the challenging question 6 months ago. The young man was now wearing a Youth Ambassador t-shirt and had a clipboard in his hand. How are the surveys going? Marcus asked, noting how much more confident the young man looked these days. Amazing. 92% of people say they feel safer in their neighborhood now. And check this out. He flipped through his papers excitedly. 8 of our youth members want to become police officers. Barrett walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead after the basketball game. Those kids are too fast for me now, he laughed. He'd lost weight over the past months, and the constant tension that used to show in his face was gone. Officer Barrett, Marcus Jr. nodded respectfully. Their relationship had evolved from distrust to genuine respect through the program's mentoring sessions. A local news crew was setting up their camera in the corner. They'd been following the program's progress since that first traffic stop went viral. Today, they were here to document the results. Chief Thompson gathered everyone around for the interview. The reporter, Lisa Chen, had been skeptical at first, but even she had become a believer in the program's impact. Officer Barrett, Lisa began, 6 months ago, you were at the center of a controversial traffic stop. Today, you're helping lead one of the most successful police community programs in the country. What changed? Barrett looked at Judge Henderson before answering. Everything changed, he said honestly. I learned to see people instead of stereotypes. I learned that being a good police officer means being part of the community, not just patrolling it. Lisa turned to Marcus. Judge Henderson, you could have pressed charges, demanded Officer Barrett's badge. Why did you choose this path instead? Marcus smiled. Because firing one officer wouldn't change the system. But changing one heart, that can start a revolution. The children had stopped playing to listen. Parents pulled them close, wanting them to remember this moment. Our city isn't perfect, Marcus continued. We still have work to do. But now we do that work together. Every traffic stop now begins with how can I help, instead of show me your ID. Every interaction is an opportunity to build trust. Barrett nodded. Last week, I pulled over a young black man in an expensive car. But instead of assuming the worst, I approached with respect. Turned out he was a doctor, rushing to the hospital for an emergency. 6 months ago, that could have gone very differently. The reporter looked around the room, at officers and community members sharing food, stories, and genuine friendship. And what's next for the program? Marcus beamed with pride. 5 other cities have already asked to implement our model. Next month, Officer Barrett and I start training their departments. But more importantly, he gestured to the room full of people. This isn't just a program anymore. It's become who we are as a community. As if to prove his point, someone turned up the music and people started dancing. Officers, community members, children, and adults, all together. The news crew kept filming, capturing what real change looks like, not in grand gestures, but in simple moments of human connection. The grand ballroom of the City Convention Center sparkled with lights as people filed in for the Bridge the Gap program's 1-year anniversary celebration. Local leaders, police officers, community members, and representatives from 20 different cities across the country had gathered to witness what began with one tense traffic stop and grew into a national movement. Judge Marcus Henderson stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd of over 500 people. Next to him stood Officer James Barrett, now promoted to sergeant and head of the department's Community Relations Division. They had just finished showing the dashcam video of that fateful night, not to shame anyone, but to remind everyone how far they'd come. 1 year ago, Marcus began, his voice carrying through the silent room. I was just a judge driving home from work. Sergeant Barrett was just an officer doing what he thought was his job. We could have become another tragic headline, another example of what divides us. Instead, we chose a different path. Barrett stepped forward to share the microphone. The numbers tell our story, he said, pointing to the large screen behind them. Traffic stops down by 65% citywide. Complaints against officers reduced by 80%. Community trust ratings up by 90%. But the real story isn't in these numbers. He gestured to a table near the front where Marcus Jr. sat with other youth leaders. It's in the faces of young people who no longer fear the police. It's in the 40 new officers who graduated from our academy last month, half of them from our own community programs. Sandra Henderson wiped away tears as she watched her husband and Barrett present together. She remembered how angry she'd been that night 1 year ago. Now she hosted monthly dinners for officers and their families at their home. Chief Thompson stood up next. When Judge Henderson and Sergeant Barrett first proposed this program, I thought they were dreamers. Maybe they were, but sometimes dreams are exactly what we need to change reality. The screen behind them showed photos from the past year: community picnics, joint training sessions, ride-alongs, youth programs, and countless moments of everyday interaction between police and citizens. Marcus Jr. approached the podium, now wearing a police cadet uniform. "A year ago, I asked how we could trust things would really change," he said, his voice confident. "Today, I'm training to become part of that change, and I'm not alone." The spotlight moved to a group of 20 young people, all program participants now entering law enforcement or legal careers. Captain Rodriguez took the microphone next. "We've had visitors from 52 cities this year, all wanting to learn from our program. 38 have already started implementing similar initiatives. This isn't just about our city anymore. It's about changing how we think about policing across America." Barrett returned to the podium, looking more relaxed and authentic than ever before. "People ask me if it was hard to admit my mistakes, to change my way of thinking. The truth is, the hardest part was facing who I used to be. The easy part was becoming who I am now." Marcus placed a hand on Barrett's shoulder. "Change isn't just about programs and policies," he said. "It's about people willing to see each other as human beings. It's about turning moments of conflict into opportunities for connection." The room burst into applause as photos appeared on the screen. Barrett and Marcus speaking at police academies across the country, conducting training sessions, appearing on national news shows, and most importantly, working with families in their own community. "We're not finished," Marcus concluded. "We've just begun. Every city that adopts this program adds their own ideas, their own improvements. What started with one traffic stop has become a blueprint for change." As music began to play, officers and community members moved to the dance floor together. Marcus watched as Barrett taught some young cadets his terrible dance moves, making everyone laugh. Sandra came up beside him. "Did you ever imagine that night would lead to all this?" she asked softly. Marcus smiled, watching the room full of people who had become more than participants in a program. They had become a family. "Sometimes," he said, "the worst moments can lead us to the best changes. We just have to be brave enough to take that first step." The celebration continued into the night, but it wasn't just a party. It was a testament to what happens when people choose understanding over anger, growth over blame, and hope over fear.